Hello everyone, I am Makoto Minami from the Graduate School of Global Humanities and Social Sciences. My major is sociology, particularly historical and international sociology. Today, I will be lecturing on sociology. The aim of today's class session is to deepen your understanding of what sociology is, the nature of the discipline, its origins and significance. Of course, it would be difficult to get you to the level of independent research or to be able to explain social phenomena using sociology over the course of 2 to 3 hours. However, I hope this is a step in that direction. At the very least, I want you to have the answer to the question, what is sociology? I have prepared this lecture assuming that the audience is completely unfamiliar with sociology. This is because, looking at the majors of the new students in the Graduate School of Global Humanities and Social Sciences, very few are in sociology. However, some of you may already know this story, in which case, please consider it a review. Nevertheless, I hope you will discover something new. So please do keep an open mind. There is a book titled Invitation to Sociology by Peter Berger from 1963 that is still read as a classic. In line with this, I would like to invite you today to an informal gathering where you will meet some historical and modern sociologists, and I hope to kindle your interest in the discipline of sociology. Of course, because of time limitations, I can only introduce a limited number of guests and theories. However, if you feel that this encounter is not enough, I encourage you to read the excellent books available on the subject to further broaden your knowledge beyond what you learn in this lecture. I want everyone to listen to today's lecture with two questions in mind. The first is what American sociologist Ken Plummer wrote on a slide he showed his students in the introduction to his sociology class. Caution, danger, beware, sociology will change your life. In what sense is sociology dangerous, and how can it change your life? Please listen to the lecture with this in mind. To give you a brief preview of how these queries may be answered, sociology, which challenges the certain kind of blindness of people who take the social world for granted, has the capacity to overturn knowledge and perceptions of what they consider obvious. Of course, it is up to you to decide whether you think this is good or bad. However, regardless of whether it is good or bad, it can certainly provide you with a new perspective and encourage you to keep thinking. Be aware that continuing to think may be unpleasant for those who do not enjoy dwelling in their thoughts. Danger, beware, may have been stated as a warning to such people. Second, it is often said that there are as many types of sociology as there are sociologists. As sociologist Karl Mannheim referred to as hyphenated sociology, the discipline comprises international, global, urban and family sociology, as well as sociology of religion, law, sports, community and knowledge, to name just a few. It is no exaggeration to say that the scope of sociology is limitless because it is a relatively new field of study as compared to history and economics, for example. Any phenomenon involving social aspects can be the subject of a sociological study. Subjects as significant as war, immigration and poverty, but also as seemingly trivial as tomatoes, toilets and telephones. Not only the breadth of sociology's scope, but also its methodology varies between sociologists. Originating in Europe, this field of study travelled to the United States and further dispersed to less developed and developing countries, and was contextualized to suit each region and country. This process has given birth to a variety of sociologies. However, is it really true that there are no common perspectives or objectives in sociology? If so, then is there really a need for the discipline of sociology in the first place? Now, before I get into the specifics, I would first like to introduce myself properly. My purpose in doing so is to show you why even I, who was not a sociology major, was attracted to sociology. I hope my experience may help show you the significance of sociology to an extent. Earlier, I introduced myself as Makoto Minami, but this is in fact my common name in Japan, and my real name is Ryo Setsuko. I was born in the countryside of Heilongjiang province in China. I came to Japan in my early teens and now live in Japan as a permanent resident. On arriving in Japan, I transferred to the first grade of junior high school, then went on to complete high school, university and graduate school before arriving at Nagasaki University in 2011. I came to Japan in 1989 and have now lived here for more than 30 years. Although I can read and write Chinese, I have mainly been educated in Japan. Therefore, my academic vocabulary is Japanese. That said, Japanese is not my mother tongue. Here, I would like to speak a little bit about my maternal grandmother. She was forced to remain in China for a long time after the war, and was finally able to return to Japan in the 1970s. My grandmother returned to Japan permanently around 1986. And my Chinese grandfather later came to Japan. My mother, the eldest daughter, followed in their footsteps. I was a young child at the time and, without much thought, I accompanied my mother to Japan with a sense of excitement rather than anxiety. At that time, I felt more like I was on an adventure into the unknown. It never occurred to me at the time that these experiences would become the starting point of my research. I would like to touch upon the details in another class when I have the chance. In terms of my educational background, although I now introduce myself as a sociology major researching borderline cultures with a focus on immigrants, particularly returnees from China, I did not begin a serious study of sociology until I entered the doctoral program of graduate school. I studied business administration, specializing in marketing as an undergraduate. As an extension, I entered a master's program with the intention of pursuing comparative research on Japanese and Chinese management systems. However, when I entered the program, my advisor suggested I base my research on Manchu immigrants. I was born in the countryside of Heilongjiang province in China, where Manchurian immigrants settled. I had heard stories about them since I was a child. At first, I did not know much about them, nor did I want to explore the subject. Upon my advisor's recommendation, I decided to study it because it was relevant to me and began reading previous studies on Manchurian immigration. In the process of doing so, I came across returnees from China. This was the beginning of my current research. Who do returnees from China refer to? Simply put, they are people like me. My grandmother, whom I mentioned earlier, was a Japanese national who remained in China and is sometimes referred to as a Japanese woman who remained in China, but she, her spouse, and their descendants are also referred to as returnees from China. In addition, there are those Japanese who remained in China and are referred to as Japanese orphans who remained in China. When we speak about returnees from China, we also include Japanese orphans who remained in China and their relatives. In reading varied literature, I was surprised to find research on returnees from China. I became curious about the origins of those Japanese who remained in China and those who became returnees from China, and I modified my master's thesis to focus on Manchurian immigrants. I also read a historical sociological study of Manchurian immigrants recommended by my advisor and had the opportunity to conduct field research in Shimoina-gun, Nagano Prefecture. This area of Nagano Prefecture was also the first place I lived on coming to Japan. While I was writing my master's thesis, a state compensation lawsuit was initiated by Japanese people who remained in China against the Japanese government, and I was involved in supporting this movement. While doing all of this, I decided to enter a doctoral program to further my research on returnees from China. In my application for admission to the doctoral program in 2003, I wrote the following about the purpose of my research as an affected party. I wrote, as a returnee from China, in order to participate in the history of this group of people and clarify my own identity, I would like to consider how returnees from China can sum up the past, determine where they are now, and set the direction for the future. For me at that time, it was more about clarifying and thinking about the unjust history of the Japanese people who remained in China than about sociological research. Although I did not yet have sociological research in mind, I somehow vaguely thought that I would try to incorporate a sociological perspective, since I did not think I would be able to achieve these research objectives with only historical findings. However, as I discovered later, this was consistent with sociological thinking. In other words, the setting of these research objectives and my awareness of the problems I was facing were in line with what C. Wright Mills called the sociological imagination. American sociologist C. Wright Mills published his book, The Sociological Imagination, in 1959, and more than 60 years later it is still read as a sociological classic and one of its fundamental texts. The book emphasizes the importance of discovering the connection between each person's life or personal history and understanding this connection within the social structure. In the 1950s, a time of social upheaval in the United States, people often became trapped in the sense that their personal lives were a series of traps. This sense was cemented by the fact that these people lacked the thinking skills to understand the relationship between man and society, personal history, and the self and the world. That power of thought is the sociological imagination, a perspective from which to think about and explore the relationship between individuals and society. This was exactly what motivated me to continue my research. In this way, I, who had no intention of becoming a researcher, was guided by an unknown force, and here I am today. Now that we understand the importance of sociological imagination, is society something we can see? What form does it take? When asked this question, is it really possible for you to envision the shape of society? Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, known as the Iron Lady, caused controversy when she said in an interview with a women's magazine that there is no such thing as society. The interview can be summarised as follows. When an individual encounters a problem, it is attributed to society and it is supposed to be solved by the government. But there is no such thing as society. There is only the individual and the family, and no government can do anything without the individual. When individuals have rights, they must also fulfil their obligations. In other words, they are obligated to help others in addition to helping themselves. This is a very neoliberal statement. This statement seems to place self-responsibility at the forefront. In other words, the logic implicitly states that because the government will only work with individuals, unless individuals fulfil their duties, help themselves or seek help from others, they will not receive public assistance. Of course, there are two aspects to this, but what we want to consider here is whether society actually exists. Although this is a Thatcherite statement, emphasising the morality of neoliberalism and the belief that it is the responsibility of the individual to help themselves, the catchphrase also calls into question the significance of sociology. Whether you have studied sociology or not, or even if you have only studied sociology a little, you will want to refute these statements, given that people do have social connections. In a graduate school admissions interview, sports sociologist Dominic Malcolm was asked by Eric Dunning, who later became his mentor, whether Thatcher was correct when she stated that there was no society. Malcolm disagreed, citing the ways in which human behaviour is shaped by mutual attitudes towards others. Dunning, however, offered a correction. Although each human being influences another's behaviour, the concept of society tends to objectify people acting as a collective whole, thus obscuring the balance of power or tension between powers that constitutes the fundamental dynamics of social life. Thatcher was right in seeing society as a conceptual construct that both constrains and enables people's ability to understand, but her view exaggerated the degree to which individualism shapes human life. Thus, society is not always visible, and the way we perceive it changes depending on our point of view. Just as there are two types of arguments, social nominalism and social realism, there is also a debate as to whether society really exists. The social nominalist view holds that society is in the mind of the individual. It is only a nominal entity and only the individual is real. Whereas the social realist view holds that society is separate from the individual. It is an external entity and has a life that cannot be reduced to the individual level. In such a dichotomy, it is difficult to determine which one is correct. Rather, we should include how the awareness that society is real emerged, how it came to function as a norm that binds us, even if we cannot see it, and how this awareness became possible. Regarding this matter, I would like to explore it today from the perspective of the birth of sociology and the lens of social history. Before I go any further, I would like to mention two subsequent events concerning Thatcher's statement. One is that former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, considered the heir to Thatcher's philosophy and the poster child for neoliberalism, contradicted Thatcher's statement in March 2020 by saying, "One thing I think the coronavirus has already proved is that there really is such a thing as society." He served as Prime Minister from July 24, 2019 to September 6, 2022. Johnson contracted the new coronavirus in March 2020 and became seriously ill for a time, but was later treated and released from the hospital. Based on these experiences, he sent out the message, "Protect the NHS, National Health Service," along with the above words. Another thing is that Thatcher's "there is no such thing as society" became a widely used catchphrase, but in fact there was no such statement in the earlier interview material. It is possible that effective editing later led to the formulation of the expression, "there is no such thing as society." A similar phenomenon can be seen in Japan. Actor Junichi Ishida attracted attention in 1996 when he said, "Adultery is culture." However, 20 years later, he clarified in an interview that he had never said this. Nevertheless, the comment that adultery is culture became a one-man statement that drew the ire of housewives, and subsequently he was dropped from commercials and programs and faced great financial trouble. I digress a bit. Let us return to the main topic. I now continue with the question, when asked what society is how would you answer? I think it is common to say that it is a gathering of people. For how long has society existed? Of course, based on Thatcher's view, some people may think that there is no such thing as society in the first place. Putting those ideas aside, I would like you to think about when society first existed. When we talk about gatherings of people, we can trace this back to ancient times, so a good answer would be that society has always existed. However, sociology was born around the 19th century and is approximately only 200 years old. Society, as we call it, also existed for the first time in this period. This may seem a bit like a play on words, but it is important to the study of the subject. I am also interested in landscapes, such as gardens and urban parks, on which I am collaborating. On a related note, I would like to ask you, which came into existence first, nature or artificiality? When I asked the same question in my undergraduate classes, most of the students answer that nature came first. This is true considering that man-made artificial landscapes are based on natural landscapes, but let us think about it a little more. If artificiality did not exist in our perception, would we have had the perception of nature in the first place? What we call nature is just something, which could be a forest, tree, stone or river, but we would not have categorized as nature. Applying these ideas to sociology, it can be said that without the birth of sociology, there would be no society. In his book, History of Sociology, Masayuki Osawa metaphorically refers to sociology as one expression of modern society's sense of self. It was not possible for modern society to become self-conscious until it matured to some extent through the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. Therefore, sociology itself is a social phenomenon, and it is important to consider its history. The cover of History of Sociology states that it is essential to grasp the entire history of sociology in order to understand not only sociology but also the surrounding disciplines. Yet, for some reason, there are very few books on the history of sociology. Therefore, as indicated in Osawa's words, I approach this task with a strong sense of social mission. The history of sociology is very important for gaining knowledge in the field of sociology. Looking back at the history of sociology, there are three peaks. The first was around the birth of the 19th century, and the second was the turn of the 20th century, up to just before World War I. The last is the period after World War II, especially after the 1960s, till the present. The second is the most spectacular and prominent of the three peaks. The sociologists active during this period were the best in terms of quality and quantity, and it is them that I will discuss in detail. In essence, it is the period of the establishment of sociology. Before proceeding, I will review the particular propositions and questions unique to sociology. The sociological question is, how is social order possible? It is only through this specific subject matter that sociology has become a unique discipline. In addition, there are two partial questions to consider regarding such an order. The first is the relationship between individuals, between certain actions, or between communications. The other is the relationship between society and the individual, between the totality of social order and various individuals' actions. Osawa elaborated on how these questions were established and how sociology was born with the maturation of a self-conscious modern society, returning to discussions that might lead to a sociological way of thinking. The book also features many people who are not generally viewed as sociologists. In addition to the economist Marx and psychologist Freud, the book traces back to the philosophers and thinkers Aristotle, Grotius, Pascal, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, among others, to discuss the self-consciousness of modern society. I cannot go into detail here, but I encourage anyone interested to pick up this book. The book additionally discusses in detail the second peak and the first leading up to it, but may seem somewhat inadequate with respect to the third. To provide a rough summary, before the birth of sociology, order was thought of and created based primarily on the existence, or of course, the non-existence of God. Indeed, one can identify sociological questions in the ethics, relations between individuals, and political science, relations between individuals and society, of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, but it cannot yet be called sociology. Social relations conceived on the basis of natural law, God's law, do not require humans to think about order. As everything is determined by God, there is no room for human consciousness. Therefore, in ancient times and the Middle Ages, the question of social order was not even considered, and it was not until the 17th century that this outlook began to change. Grotius, called the father of international law and the father of modern natural law, argued that human beings have the right to self-preservation and the natural obligation not to infringe upon the life and property of others without necessity, even if these rights are not written in law. That is to say, even if God did not exist or did not care about human affairs, these two principles would still hold. For the first time, he referred to a world without God. Of course, there is also Pascal's wager that it is better to bet on God's presence, given that if God is present but we act as if he is not, we will face a terrible outcome at the final judgment. That is, we will go to hell. Grotius actually follows this logic as well. Ultimately, we are not separate from the world of God. This kind of thinking is not the soil in which sociology, as we know it today, was born and grew. It is in discussions that do not presuppose God that we can sense the presence of sociology and the signs of its birth. The previous discussions were all based on the assumption of God's existence. It was a man named Thomas Hobbes who developed the argument that completely ignored the existence of God. In 1651, Hobbes published his book, Leviathan, in which he argued for the creation of a peaceful society by abandoning the natural rights of the individual for the protection of an absolute sovereign, or Leviathan, which in its entirety is a metaphor for the state, instead of the struggle of all against all. This is because it is possible to imagine that the retention of natural rights in the state of nature, the rights to self-preservation, often involves violations against others. For example, how can the right to self-preservation be exercised in a situation where there are 10 people and there is only enough food for one? Simply put, it would be acceptable to kill others. Clearly, this state of nature should not be left unchanged. It is precisely this situation that Hobbes refers to as the struggle of all against all. To avoid such a situation, it is necessary to renounce natural rights and to maintain such a social contract. Thus, it is necessary to take some measures to force people to renounce their natural rights. Therefore, he thought that it would be best be left to an absolute sovereign, who represents the head of the metaphorical biblical monster, Leviathan. Hobbes' argument is still referred to as a classic. It is characterized by the fact that it puts forward the notion of equality among all individuals at the starting point, without presupposing the existence of God. It is not sociology, but it is a pre-sociological society, a primordial society, where birth might not have occurred, but conception has. Hobbes' discussion of order was later critically extended by Parsons, who called it the Hobbesian problem. I will speak more about Hobbes, taking Parsons' point into account. Hobbes' argument is fanciful and not based on historical facts. It sounds good as an ideal, but does it work in practice? Given that individuals are always conscious of others when deciding whether to relinquish their natural rights, we show this using a principle similar to what is called the prisoner's dilemma in game theory. It is often used when discussing double contingency, wherein the choices of the self and others both depend on the choices of the other. And also when discussing social dilemmas, wherein the outcome may be rational for the self, but never desirable for the whole. Amartya Sen calls such individuals rational fools. To illustrate this, with a familiar example, consider the case of toilet paper disappearing from store shelves after the spread of the new coronavirus. In February 2020, false rumours spread, mainly on social networking sites, that the ingredients of masks and toilet paper are the same. Toilet paper will disappear in the future owing to the new pneumonia, and stock up on toilet paper, which led to a shortage of toilet paper. Businesses and the government called for sufficient stock. Despite calls for calm, toilet paper disappeared from store shelves for a long time. This decision was based on the rational choice of individuals. This means that regardless of whether there is enough stock, others will rush to buy things, and if you do not rush as well, there will be no toilet paper for you to use. My family ignored the news when it first came out, and we almost ran out of toilet paper at home. We struggled for a few days because we could not buy any. So the next time I made sure to buy in bulk. The same can be said for masks. Let us return to the Hobbes discussion. If you were me, would you give up your natural rights without a second thought? If you assume that others will not waive theirs, will you also choose to not waive yours? Hobbes' argument does not hold, since the transition from D to A, the most desirable state for all, can never be achieved by simply relinquishing natural rights and handing them over to the Leviathan. Something else is needed to make it happen. This is what Parson called the Hobbesian problem, and it was the proposition on which he built his theory of social systems. Parsons will appear again later, and we will examine his theory in greater detail then. The godfather of sociology is a man named Auguste Comte. If Hobbes' argument is an analogy for the conception of sociology, then it would be fair to say that Auguste Comte's argument brought it to a period of stability. In terms of the idea of truth, the medieval and modern worlds differ greatly. Until the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries, all truth was revealed by God. Religious history was the only way to understand the truth, and only those who were blessed and favoured by God could understand the truth. In the Age of Enlightenment, truth was liberated from the authority of God. A path was opened that allowed insight into truth through the capacity of human reason, a path that sought to obtain truth from an empirical analysis of reality. Under these circumstances, history was the first social science, followed by economics, political science, and sociology. Anthropology and Oriental studies were born out of the modern world. Comte believed that history could be viewed in terms of laws and advocated for the law of 3 stages, that is, the theological, metaphysical, and positive stages. The human psyche moved from the stage of thinking using religion to thinking intuitively using reason, independent of divine authority, and then to the stage of thinking scientifically. Rather than saying that the Industrial Revolution brought about modernity, Comte believed that the change in spirit and worldview behind it, the scientific revolution, was what was important. When asked what sociology is, Zygmunt Bauman often replied, "Conversation with human experience." Without human experience, sociology would not have been born. While Hobbes' thinking was based on imagination, it was only with Comte that human experience began to be visualized. It can be said that without Comte, there would have been no sociology. However, Comte has not made much of a sociological contribution since. Karl Marx was another scholar who contributed to the stabilization of sociology. Marx is introduced here along with the background of the establishment of modern society. The establishment of modern society was triggered by 2 major historical events: the Industrial Revolution in England, which occurred between the mid-18th and 19th centuries, and the French Revolution in the 18th century. Without these environmental changes, neither a modern society nor sociology could have been established. Most importantly, these 2 events led to the establishment of mass society. The role of sociology was to consider this mass society. One of the impulses of the French Revolution was the establishment of the revolutionary idea that the political system and society connected with it were subject to change and that the people were sovereign. The birth of the aforementioned discipline is linked to this way of thinking. The traditional, unchanging feudal class system was destroyed, and a mass society was born in which everyone was equal and sovereign. I mentioned earlier that Hobbes' argument had equality as its starting point. However, it differs from mass society after the French Revolution in that the final transfer of natural rights is limited to certain people. If everyone has a final say or sovereignty, the Hobbesian problem becomes even more complicated. As another impetus, the Industrial Revolution established the so-called market and capitalism, including its realities and ideas, using the colonies as raw material suppliers and markets. The social and economic environment was created by the Puritan Revolution and the Glorious Revolution. The accumulated capital and easy access to finance and the surplus of labour brought about by the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution brought about the establishment and consolidation of what we know today as marketism and capitalism, both in reality and conceptually. These two events brought about the expansion of material productive forces through the division of labour, the global expansion of markets, the era of colonial empires, and the emergence of the working masses. For the new mass society, sociology, as Comte put it, focused on how to grasp and control the masses, which presents an additional level of complexity. One might call it an imperialistic conception. On the other hand, classical economics originated from marketism and capitalism. Adam Smith claimed that if left to the invisible hand, in other words, the market, supply and demand would naturally adjust and an economic exchange system would be formed that would satisfy everyone. But has this really occurred? If this had been the case, Marx, who highlighted the flaws in capitalism, would not have emerged. Marx is often presented as a 19th century German economist, philosopher, and revolutionary. However, his scientific socialism is imbued with sociological ideas. Together with Engels, Marx formulated scientific socialism as a comprehensive worldview and revolutionary ideology. He taught that the advanced development of capitalism would usher in socialist and communist societies. His theories have profoundly influenced social sciences today. Marx's writings were required reading for several decades, but are now rarely read. The same phenomenon can be observed in China, a communist country. Of course, we should consider how Marxist thought was carried out in China, a market-oriented communist country. I read Marx's writings indirectly rather than systematically. However, from what I have heard from my professor, who has been a great help to me since I was a graduate student, and from the literature I have read, I have a sense of the greatness of Marx's ideas. You might think of his ideas as a kind of intellectual storehouse. Without going deeper here, I will limit my introduction to the parts that led to sociological ideas. Marx, similar to Adam Smith, was not optimistic about capitalism. In particular, when focusing on the working class, he saw it as progressing in a direction opposite to that envisioned by Smith. He expressed that in a capitalist society, although workers generate more profit than the actual labour involved in making the product, that wealth is not put into their pockets but taken by capitalists. Instead of being resolved as capitalism proliferates, this structural exploitation actually tends to escalate. This implies that it cannot be left to an invisible hand. If left to its own devices, workers will suffer increasingly from poverty. inequality will deepen and happiness will decline. To solve these problems, Marx advocated socialism, in which the means of production are shared and the products distributed equally. To achieve this, he believed that the working class should rally and struggle for the realisation of socialism, which would eventually be realised with the collapse of capitalist society. In other words, social transformation through revolution. Based on Marx's idea of scientific socialism, not only China, but also Russia, North Korea, Cuba and other countries launched socialist revolutions in the 20th century. Marxian theory has many points of contention, even in the details of its argument. For example, as a starting point for discussion, he points out that the difference between man and animals is that man produces his own means of livelihood, namely the mode of production. Mode of production may sound like an everyday term, but it is a Marxian term. To examine these modes of production, he prepared topics such as base and superstructure, alienation and materialization, value form, surplus value, and class. These discussions eventually led to the development of sociology. A rough summary of Marx's characteristics is the scheme in which the base, also known as the substructure, defines the superstructure. The base is the economic system, that is, the mode of production based on productive forces and relations of production, whereas the superstructure refers to political, legal and ideological aspects. In other words, people's actions are defined by the base, but is this really the case in reality? This is the question that gave rise to sociology. Before explaining this concept of sociology, I would like to review a few more sociological elements in Marx's argument. As can be seen from the following text, humans are positioned as social beings. I am engaged in activities as a human, thus I am social. Therefore, when I make something on my own, I make it for the benefit of society. Moreover, I create it while being conscious of the fact that I am an individual social entity. Another statement reads, human beings are not born into this world with a mirror, nor are they born as philosophers following fixed philosophy stating, I am what I am. Thus, humans first seek to see themselves reflected in others. Only by relating to the human Paul as his equal does the human Peter relate to himself as a human being. But at the same time, for Peter, the entirety of Paul, retaining his distinct physicality, is recognized as the manifestation of the human race. As a specially chosen apostle of Christ, Peter begins to recognize his own humanity by relating to Paul, a fellow human being. It is through others that we recognize ourselves. Mutual recognition, one might say. From the above two statements, one can see that the relationship between man and society, between man and man, is discussed as a partial question of sociology. Finally, we come to the seminal period of sociology, the second peak, the period of sociological establishment. Conclusively, we can say that sociological methodology was almost entirely established during this period. The answer to there are as many types of sociology as there are sociologists can be considered through Marx's story. What do you think sociology inherited from Marx's argument? In what ways does Marx's argument differ from those of Aristotle, Grotius, Pascal, Hobbes, Comte and others. After all, it is not merely thinking but analysis based on social facts above all else. As previously mentioned, this attitude has been thoroughly examined in Marx's discussions, just as Bauman defined sociology as conversation with human experience. Sociology, too, inherited these ideas and the attitude of being involved in social reform and critically examining the base and superstructure theory. It clarified on the basis of facts that the superstructure also has the power to define the base, rather than just the economic base defining the superstructure theory. In other words, Marx discovered society's self-consciousness. Here I will focus on three scholars who were active during this period: Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, and Georg Simmel. These three scholars were chosen because of their different perspectives on interpersonal relationships, the relationship between individuals and society, and establishing social order. People generally refer to Durkheim for methodological collectivism, Weber for methodological individualism, and Simmel for methodological relationalism. I will begin with a brief introduction of each scholar's profile. All three were of the same generation. Emil Durkheim, 1858 to 1917. Max Weber, 1864 to 1920. And Georg Simmel, 1858 to 1918. Durkheim and Simmel were born in the same year, and Weber was born slightly later, but the three were active at approximately the same time. Both Durkheim and Simmel were Jewish. Weber and Simmel were born in Germany, whereas Durkheim was born in France. Moreover, they were all raised in relatively privileged circumstances and were able to develop their research activities without suffering from economic poverty in adulthood. This is very different from Marx, who had to move from one residence to another and suffered financially. Let us take a closer look at the life histories of each of them. Durkheim was born in Epinal, a town in the Lorraine region of France near the German border. His father, grandfather and great-grandfather were all Jewish rabbis, and he was raised in a family that strictly observed religious discipline. Durkheim himself described his upbringing as a member of a Jewish community as being tightly knit with little room for heterogeneity among individuals. He received the religious education required of a rabbi, but sought a more scientific education from his teenage years. In 1879, after 2 failed examinations, he entered the Higher Normal School in Paris. His grades were mediocre, and in 1882 he was second from the bottom in the teaching qualification examination. In 1885, he was sent by the Ministry of Education to conduct a survey on moral education in Germany, and his report was well received. He was entrusted by the Ministry of Education with the chair of social sciences, and his institute became the first French university to offer a course in sociology. Thus, Durkheim became the first French professor of sociology. During his time at the University of Bordeaux, Durkheim published a number of major works. His doctoral dissertation, The Division of Labour in Society, was published in 1893. The Rules of Sociological Method in 1895, and Suicide, a Study in Sociology in 1897. Then, in 1898, he began publishing the journal, The Sociological Year. This biannual publication became the centre of French sociology, and it was where the ideas of the Durkheim school of thought were publicised. In 1902, at the age of 44, he was invited to be the chair of educational sciences at the University of Paris-Sorbonne to lecture on moral education. Thus, Durkheim rose from the periphery of French society to the centre of the French Republic. His opposition to Judaism in his youth led to an unexpected increase in his interest in religion in his later years, and in 1912 he published his last major work, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. After the outbreak of World War I in 1914, his promising pupil and son, André, enlisted in the army, and Durkheim received the news of his death in April 1916. Durkheim never got over his son's death. He continued to devote himself to his work, but became physically exhausted and fell ill, dying in 1917 at the age of 59. Durkheim was rarely involved in social or political movements, and instead steadily followed his scholarly career. He did, however, pay special attention to the Dreyfus affair. In the midst of the war between France and Germany, Alfredo Dreyfus, a Jewish army captain, was arrested in 1894 for selling information to Germany and was imprisoned for life by a military court-martial. In January 1898, the writer Émile Zola published his indictment, I Accuse, and public opinion was at fever pitch. Durkheim joined the Human Rights League of the Retrialists, and apparently saw the case not as racism, but as a moral pathology facing French society as a whole, and felt the need to help end moral anarchy, becoming actively involved in the activities. Dreyfus was completely exonerated in 1906 and his honour restored. It is also worth mentioning that after the outbreak of World War I, when France was at war with Germany, Durkheim, a French citizen who was more patriotic than average, became involved in propaganda and public relations to condemn the German Empire and boost the morale of the French Republic. Weber was born in Erfurt, Germany, to Father Max, who came from a wealthy linen merchant family. His father was a lawyer and government official. When Weber was 5 years old, the family moved to Berlin, since his father became a delegate to the National Liberal Party. His mother, Helen, came from Heidelberg's high society and was a devout Protestant. The house was frequented by politicians and intellectuals, and Weber was intellectually precocious. After entering the University of Heidelberg in 1882, he studied law, history, economics and philosophy. After a year of military service, he studied diligently and passed the bar exam. His doctoral dissertation, The History of Commercial Partnerships in the Middle Ages, and his university lecturer qualification dissertation, Roman Agrarian History and its Significance for Public and Private Law, qualified him to lecture on commercial law and other subjects in 1892. Around the same time, he completed a survey of agricultural labour in East Elbe at the request of the Society for Social Policy Studies. In 1893, he married his cousin Marianne and started his own business. In 1897, he was invited as a professor to his alma mater, the University of Heidelberg. His seemingly smooth scholarly career ended when he developed depression, suffering from fever, severe nervousness, insomnia, and fatigue to the point that he could no longer give lectures. As a result, he submitted his resignation to the university in the winter of 1899 and left in October 1903 at the age of 39 to become a private scholar. From then on, he spent the remainder of his life living off the interest from his family fortune. At this point in his career, Weber had yet to produce a single major work in sociology. Curiously, much of Weber's work on sociology was written after he became ill and left the university. For example, in 1904 he published The Objectivity of Social, Scientific and Socio-Political Knowledge and the first half of The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism in a journal. The second half of the latter was published in the following year. He continued to work in fits and starts, but in 1910 he entered a prolific period. In 1911-13 he wrote the first draft of Economics and Society and proceeded to work on the economic ethics of world religions, comparing various world religions. And after 1915 he published Confucianism and Taoism, Hinduism and Buddhism, Ancient Judaism and more. Ironically, it was the outbreak of World War I in 1914 that decisively brought Weber back from illness. As a nationalist, he immediately reported for duty as a reservist, even though he was now 50 years old, working 13 hours a day in an army hospital and even giving lectures to the wounded. After the collapse of the German Empire in November 1918, he became a member of the German Democratic Party and was involved in drafting the post-war constitution at the Ministry of the Interior. He also decided to run for the National Assembly, but changed his mind in January of the following year. In May of the same year, he went to Versailles as a member of a delegation for a lecture and devoted the last years of his life to political practice. However, in June 1919, at the age of 55, he resumed his teaching activities as a full professor at a university and moved to Munich. He gave lectures on academic studies and politics as professions. He made a strong impression on his students by lecturing on sociological categories in the summer semester of 1919 and on the theory of the state and socialism the following year. However, at the end of May 1920, he caught a cold and died of acute pneumonia 2 weeks later on June 14th at the age of 56. Unlike Durkheim, Weber was actively involved in political activities. The reason for this, I believe, is his own sense of awareness of the surrounding circumstances. Of course, Weber came from the German bourgeoisie. However, in Germany at that time, it was the landowning aristocracy, the Junkers, who held political power, and their representative was Chancellor Bismarck. Weber was not a minority like Marx, Durkheim, or Jewish Simmel. or someone who lived on the periphery of society in a Junker-led German society. However, Germany was on the periphery of Europe, with neither democracy nor industrialization, making a bourgeoisie like Weber also conscious of living on the periphery of society. Perhaps it was because of this consciousness that Weber remained a nationalist who wished to push the German nation-state into the centre of Europe. This may explain why he became immersed in political activism in his later years after World War I. Compared with Durkheim and Weber, Simmel's life was far less tumultuous. Born in Berlin, his father, Edward, was an assimilated Jewish merchant who converted to Catholicism and founded a chocolate company called Felix and Cerotti. The chocolate company still exists today. His mother was baptized a Protestant, and as the youngest of 7 children, Simmel was also baptized a Protestant and raised by his mother with great affection. Although Simmel grew up in a financially well-to-do, intellectually and culturally baptized family, he was neither an aristocrat nor a worker, but a bourgeoisie. He studied history, psychoethnology, and philosophy at the University of Berlin, and in 1881 was awarded a doctorate in philosophy for his dissertation on the nature of matter according to Kant's physical monadology. His dissertation was dedicated to Julius Friedlander, the owner of Peters, a well-known publisher of sheet music, who became his guardian after Simmel's father died in 1874. When Friedlander died in 1889, Simmel inherited a vast estate. From this point on, Simmel was free from financial worries and, like Weber, lived off the interest from his fortune. However, being Jewish, his lifelong career as a scholar was fraught with difficulties from the outset. Once he submitted his doctoral dissertation on music theory, it was rejected and he was forced to retake an exam lecture in his application for professorship. His problems and intellectual sensitivity may have been incompatible with the German philosophical academism of the time, but above all, they stemmed from his Jewish descent. In 1885, at the age of 27, he became a private lecturer at the University of Berlin, but did not hold a full-time position until 1914, 4 years before his death, when he became a professor at the University of Strasbourg. Incidentally, private lecturers earn their income from listening fees from their audience, and Simmel's lectures were so popular that they were considered a Berlin tradition, particularly attracting minority audiences such as women, Poles, Russians and Jews. During this period, Weber, who was still using the facilities at the University of Heidelberg, attempted to invite Simmel in 1908 and 1915, failing both times due to anti-Semitism. Simmel left behind a vast body of writing, including his philosophical reflections since his doctoral dissertation, and a vast number of essays and materials that can be categorized under sociology. The main works related to sociology are On Social Differentiation, Sociology, Fundamental Questions of Sociology, and The Philosophy of Money. Despite the enormous influence of his lectures and writings, he remained an academic disappointment, dying of liver cancer on September 26, 1918, at the age of 60. Throughout his life, Simmel never became politically active or rose to the top of the academic world, living most of his life, except for his last years, in Berlin, the city of his birth. It is clear, however, that his Jewish background limited his social advancement, even though he was a talented young man. Despite being in the centre of Germany, Berlin, he lived a peripheral existence as a Jew. What do you feel when you hear about the lives of these three great luminaries of the sociological establishment? Durkheim became the first French professor of sociology, and Weber obtained a university post at a young age. In contrast, Simmel, due to being Jewish, had moderate difficulty obtaining a post at a university, which led him to write books, gaining fame as a scholar in the community. Of course, being Jewish is not the only reason, considering Durkheim was a French Jew. However, the differences in anti-Semitic attitudes between France and Germany also play a role. The reason I have presented the lives of the three men in detail is related to my prevailing thoughts every time I come into contact with an academic theory. What drives a person to conceptualize a theory? I often ask myself that simple question. What I found common in the lives of these three people, whether they were happy or not, was that they all had questions about the current situation, were motivated to try to explain those questions, and actually tried to verbalize their answers. All three shared the same attitude of trying to think from a distance by placing themselves on the periphery, whether subjectively or objectively. Without this attitude, sociology would not be as we know it today. Despite the similarities and differences in the lives of these three luminaries, their contributions to sociology are not particularly different. All three are often referred to as sociologists from the dawn or establishment of sociology. We now examine how each of these three critically examined Marx's base and superstructure, attempted social reforms, and defined society. First, Durkheim. Building on Marx's argument, Durkheim argued for the existence of society as having equal to or greater power than the economy. He proposed as a criterion of sociological method that society be treated as an entity, not reduced to the individual, but as an organism in which actions and modes of thinking shared by the group exist beyond the individual and binds individuals. This view takes a different position from Weber, who seeks the existence of society in the subjective consciousness of the individual, which we will discuss later. Although the individual in a community is supposed to be happy, modern society makes it difficult for them to be so. Individuals are often unable to find their place in society. This is called anomie. To solve this problem, Durkheim said that sociology must be founded as a science that helps modern people become aware of the community that exists around them, accept it and place themselves in it through a scientific search for the social laws that have come to exist outside the individual. That is, Marx's deprivation of state power. He wanted to look ahead to the construction of a socialist society that would differ from Marx's seizure of state power. Durkheim argued that crime is a normal part of society. What do you think of this? Do you agree? You would think that crime is usually a matter to be criticised and certainly cannot be considered normal. Again, one wonders what Durkheim is trying to say. Of course, Durkheim is not advocating crime. I am sure that if you listen to his explanation, you will understand. Durkheim also said, "We do not condemn it because it is a crime, but it is a crime because we condemn it." In other words, What constitutes a crime is never a predetermined normative value, but rather a social value norm that confirms it. It is only when a society's standards of right and wrong operate normally that we can distinguish between crimes, and such a society is normal. For example, let us consider Auschwitz and the Holocaust. How was it possible to murder more than 6 million Jews? Could it have been seen as a crime in German society at that time? In other words, crime is a necessary evil for society. Society operates normally by distinguishing between crimes. This is the point of Durkheim's argument. Durkheim's most distinctive methodological feature is a study called suicide, a study in sociology. Through the study of suicidology, Durkheim identified and depicted society as an object that constrained the individual. Thus far, we have said that if left to market forces, modern society would become increasingly mature and people would be happier. That is Adam Smith's idea. The happiness hypothesis states that people would become wealthier and happier as they modernized. That is, modernization promotes human happiness. But what was the reality? Durkheim focused on the increase in the suicide rate as a social reality, a phenomenon that runs counter to it. He attempted to diagnose it as a social pathology and examine the relationship between society and individuals as a general proposition. He feared that the increase in the suicide rate did not reflect the dazzling lustre of civilization, but rather a state of confusion that, if prolonged, could lead to a crisis. Avoiding the arrival of such a crisis was the starting point of Durkheim's research into suicide. His research aimed to improve society. One characteristic of Durkheim's theory of suicide is its extensive use of statistical data. It is no exaggeration to say that this is an exemplary study on the use of statistical data in sociology. Furthermore, the study critically examined all non-social factors that had been discussed in conventional suicide research before entering into a specific analysis. In conventional morphological studies, mental illness, family discord, economic problems, heartbreak, race, genetics, climate, seasons, and imitation were considered causes of suicide, but Durkheim refuted each of these factors with statistical data. For example, he refuted them by enumerating that no statistical correlation could be found for psychiatric abnormalities, that the incidence of psychosis is higher in women than in men, but the suicide rate is higher in men in all countries, and that the onset period is around age 30, but suicide is higher in old age. Finally, only the social factors remained. Durkheim explored causation theory, rather than traditional morphological research, and analysed social types of suicide by general condition, which he categorised as 4 types: altruistic suicide, egoistic suicide, fatalistic suicide, and anomic suicide. In dividing these types, we analyse them with the influence of the group in mind, that is, the degree of binding to social norms and the strength of social integration and regulation. In other words, Durkheim believed that if he could analyse the group forces that affect suicide rates, he could become aware of a previously unacknowledged society. In other words, Durkheim's attempts were successful, contributing to sociology as we know it. Let us further examine his social types of suicide. First, egoistic suicide results from the weakening of social integration and solidarity and the isolation of the individual from group life. Durkheim considered this from the perspectives of religion, family, and political society. Protestants have higher suicide rates than Catholics, and Jews higher than Protestants. This phenomenon has traditionally been interpreted as a minority religion being more likely to commit suicide. Durkheim says that this is not the case, and that the key point is whether each religion condones suicidal behaviour. Both the Protestant and Catholic denominations prohibit suicide. However, Protestants allow for a considerably wider range of free consideration, implying that they were less socially integrated as a group. As for families, a comparison of the number of suicides in France between 1863 to 1868 shows 16,000 suicides among married couples and 12,000 suicides among the unmarried. Based on these data, it is possible to interpret marriage and family life as increasing the risk of suicide. However, further examination reveals that almost no one under the age of 16 committed suicide. Furthermore, the suicide rate for married people is 154.5 out of a million, whereas the rate for unmarried people is 173 out of a million. Although the total numbers seem to indicate that more married people committed suicide, the suicide rate among those who never married was higher. It can then be said that the presence of family members does not increase suicide. Rather, it is the heightened sense of group spirit and responsibility felt through participation in an enduring group that survives across generations through blood ties that plays a role in keeping people alive. In addition, the results of the study by age and legal status, married, unmarried, widowed, showed that 1. Extremely early marriage promotes increased suicide, especially among boys. 2. The suicide rate is higher for unmarried men and women than for married men and women aged 20 years and older. 3. The deterrent effect of suicide among married people differs by sex, with men being particularly strong. 4. The suicide rate for widows is higher than that for married individuals. And 5. The suicide rate for men is higher than that for widows, and the suicide rate for widows is higher than that for married people. Thus, the family, as a group, functions as a force for social integration. Although we might think that war and political upheaval may lead to an increase in suicides. In fact, they do not. Rather, they actually encourage a decrease in suicide rates. This is because when social upheavals, such as national wars, occur, they animate collective emotions, inspire patriotism, partisanship, and political and national convictions, and focus various activities towards the same single goal, creating, at least temporarily, a very strong social unity. In sum, the suicide rate was found to be inversely related to the strength of social integration, and suicide was found to increase or decrease in inverse relation to the strength of religious, family, political and social integration. In other words, the invisible forces of these groups and the mysterious factors that encourage suicide are what we refer to as society. The opposite of egoistic suicide is altruistic suicide. These are suicides that occur when a society has a strong degree of integration and authority and forces or encourages individuals to take their own lives. Such suicides are common in primitive and traditional societies, such as martyrdom and military suicides. Then there is anomic suicide, wherein suicide is due to disillusionment and futility in individuals who are driven by unregulated desires as a result of the loosening or breakdown of social norms and the loss of proper control over individual desires. Anomy is such an important concept in Durkheimian theory that it is often referred to as Durkheim's anomy. In his study of suicide, Durkheim focused on economic and family anomy. Traditionally, economic poverty was thought to increase suicide. However, Durkheim's research showed that this phenomenon was found only in Ireland. Conversely, Italy and Germany were identified as countries where suicide rates increased despite the prosperity of their economies. Thus, the happiness hypothesis does not hold. As people become richer, their desires increase infinitely. And when they feel that they cannot achieve their desires or find it difficult to achieve them, they experience a sense of emptiness and choose suicide. Family anomy, on the other hand, is a case in which a person commits suicide because they no longer feel a sense of responsibility and have lost their meaning in life as a result of divorce or the loss of the family's binding force. The opposite of anomic suicide is fatalistic suicide, caused by a sense of entrapment owing to excessive repressive control over one's desires. This type of suicide, however, is considered for consistency of typology and only mentioned in a footnote discussing anomic suicide. It is not discussed in detail. These are suicides that result from over-regulation and the suicides of people whose futures are mercilessly closed to them, such as young urban husbands and childless wives. The fact that they have only historical significance is also why they have not been discussed in detail. However, fatalistic suicides are rarely discussed. In the Sociological History, written by Masayuki Osawa, there was no mention of fatalistic suicide. When examining Durkheim's theory of suicide from today's perspective, it is not difficult to identify problems in the collection and analysis of statistical data and attempts at typification. However, no one can deny his achievement in discovering, through his research into suicide, that there is a collective stream of consciousness in society that is distinct from individual circumstances, emotions, and motivations, and exerts a dominant influence on the way of life and thinking of each individual. As a practical response, he pointed out that the 3- to 5-fold spike in suicides in France, Germany, and Austria were not normal, and revealed that most of them were egoistic and anomic suicides, which are hallmarks of modern society. As a solution, Durkheim proposed the expectations of an occupational group. By belonging to an occupational group, one can clarify one's social position and maintain ties within it, thereby curbing suicidal tendencies. When you hear the words connection and kizuna, ties, do you think of anything else? The topic of loneliness is often discussed in Japan, just as words such as disconnected society and individualization have become popular. Reading Durkheim, we find propositions relevant to modern society. This is probably why his work is considered a classic. Regardless of how many years have passed, reading it confirms where we stand today and encourages us to reflect. Next is Max Weber. In relation to Marxian theory, Weber largely acknowledged that economic interests have often determined the direction of history, but proved through concrete examples that subjective human consciousness, mediated by belief in charisma or religion, can also be an influential force. He also emphasized the unique influence of bureaucracy and state policies, and proposed positioning sociology as a science that explains and predicts the consequences of specific policies for implementation in light of those mechanisms. Unlike Marx, he envisioned a parliamentary democracy that would control the bureaucracy of the state, which had not disappeared even after the revolution. In this way, he attempted to position sociology as an instrument for improving society through policy. Weber was also a pioneer in historical sociology, and his research demonstrated that human subjective consciousness can also be a driving force that changes historical direction through the mediation of belief in charisma and religion, as explained in his The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Because it is colloquially known as prolin in the Japanese language, it will hereafter be referred to as such. For Weber, the ultimate subject was the elucidation of rationalization, which is the essence of modernization. He saw modernization as the rationalization of various areas of society. Prolin considers how this rationalization of modernity emerged in the West. Weber's interpretation of the factors that shaped it was based on the high percentage of Protestants among professional workers in Germany, such as business owners, tradesmen, upper-skilled workers and technicians, who adapted to the capitalist economy. In brief, the conclusion is that economic activity based on the professional ethics of ascetic Protestantism became the spirit of capitalism and promoted its rise and that of modernization. Weber examined this spirit of capitalism in comparison with traditional economic ethics. For example, during the agricultural harvest season, there are two possible ways to measure improvements in worker productivity. One is to raise the wages of employed farmers from 600 yen per hectare to 800 yen per hectare. The other to lower the piece rate wage from 600 yen to 400 yen per hectare. You would probably choose the one with the highest piece rate without hesitation. I would probably make the same choice. However, Protestants would work even when the piece rate was lowered. Rather, they worked more hours than they would have if they had been paid a higher piece rate. At first glance, this may seem strange. However, this is the economic ethics of capitalism. Weber argues, citing Benjamin Franklin's advice to young merchants, 1748, "Remember that time is money." In other words, in the pursuit of wealth beyond necessity and the attitude of trying to use time efficiently, Weber called this attitude of saving money as a principle of life ethos with an ethical colour, the spirit of capitalism. However, wherein the pursuit of wealth is purposeful and rational, the effort to earn more and more money combined with the strict avoidance of all spontaneous enjoyment of life is, from the point of view of happiness, absolutely irrational. In this light, one wonders whether this working Protestantism was not a perversion of the natural state of affairs or a senseless act. Nevertheless, the emergence of a capitalist economic ethic still needs to be considered in comparison with the traditionalist economic ethic that had been in place until then. In traditionalist economic ethics, the pursuit of profit through labour was a degrading act. Thus, if one's income is sufficient to meet one's needs to a certain extent, there is no motivation to work any longer. If the required amount of money is 4,000 yen, according to the traditionalist approach to economic ethics, harvesting 5 acres is sufficient. The remaining time can be used for leisure activities, self-improvement, and so on. However, if you are paid a lower piece rate, you will have to work twice as hard and harvest 10 hectares to earn the same 4,000 yen. Despite this, Protestants did not see it as a degrading thing, but as their mission, and they worked diligently. As a result, wealth accumulated, leading to the generation and advancement of capitalism. In this example, it can be said that the higher the production volume, paradoxically, the lower the efficiency. So, how did this economic ethic of capitalism come about? In Christianity, any view aimed at the acquisition of money is considered amoral in any age. Rather than pursuing external things, church practices were recommended. Martin Luther, the religious reformer, coined the term calling for secular occupations and developed the idea of making them a moral endeavour. However, it was not easy to break away from traditionalist economic ethics and adapt to the current living conditions. Weber explains that the capitalist ethos and economic ethics were born from the doctrine of election by grace. In other words, the theory of predestination. Man, imbued with original sin, loses the power of salvation, and only God can save him. God's salvation is, according to Calvin, by the decree of God, for the manifestation of his glory. Some men and angels are predestinated unto everlasting life, and others foreordained to everlasting death. In other words, at the time of the last judgment, some people will be given everlasting life, and others everlasting death. God has already chosen the outcome before creating the world, and man cannot change or comprehend which destiny awaits him. In this manner, God exists at an infinite distance from man, and from that vantage point, God has predestined some people for everlasting life, and others for everlasting death. It is impossible for man to overturn God's design. Until then, the Church promised salvation to Catholics by performing rituals, sacraments, and encouraging good deeds, donations, and buying indulgences. However, according to the doctrine of predestination, not even a priest can know God's design. Therefore, it is impossible to seek salvation from the Catholic Church. Thus, Protestantism, which emerged after the Reformation, criticised Catholic ideas and practices. However, this alone did not create a capitalistic ethos. It was in the midst of anxiety, loneliness and tension over whether they could be saved that an ascetic attitude toward life was born, leading to the capitalist ethos. People struggled with the question, am I chosen, and how can I be sure of the choice? One way to resolve this was to banish doubt and gain assurance of salvation through vocational labour. Labour, secular work, to increase the glory of God and love of thy neighbour, is not just service to other fellow creatures, but rather through one's efforts to better this world that God has created. If man is able to do this, it is evidence that he is chosen. This is called the doctrine of assurance. Labour within the secular world is a divine calling, and by doing it well, we become aware of a meaningful faith, which leads to the assurance of salvation. Thus, a change in the secular view of vocation, influenced by the idea of a divine calling, predestination, and the doctrine of assurance, gave rise to capitalist economic ethics and ethos. However, this capitalist spirit was not initially aimed at the creation and maintenance of capitalism. Weber believed it to be a phenomenon that has arisen as an unintended consequence. In Prolin, when referring to the Puritans, the bearers of capitalism, he says, "The salvation of the soul alone was the centre of their life and work. Their ethical ideals and the practical results of their doctrines were all based on that alone, as were the consequences of purely religious motives. We shall thus have to admit that the cultural consequences of the Reformation were to a great extent unforeseen and even unwished for results of the labours of their reformers. They were often far removed from or even in contradiction to all that they themselves thought to attain." Capitalism existed in China and India, as well as in ancient and medieval times. However, in Weber's view, this spirit of capitalism was found only in modern Western Europe and North America. In Weber's arguments, only in the West is often the starting point for research. This includes the spirit of capitalism, science, rational law, harmonics in music, Gothic architecture, newspapers and magazines, regularly elected assemblies, and so on. To examine these, we must identify the relationship between economic development and religious ethics in other cultures. In other words, it involves a comparative study of other cultures. Later, Weber would compile a collection of articles on the sociology of religion through comparative studies of religion in other regions. It is by no means easy to summarise the characteristics of Weber's research briefly. There are countless theoretical studies on his research. As a historical sociology major myself, I presented my own research at the Japan Sociological Society in 2012. As a result, I receive emails from the Weber study group. Although a century has passed since Weber's death, his work is still being read, referenced and discussed. I am reminded each time I receive an email from the study group about the wide variety of topics covered. I do not have time to go into any more detail, but in line with the content of today's lecture, I would like to mention, among other things, the focus on action and the extraction of ideological types as a characteristic of Weber's research. As already mentioned, Weber, like Marx, acknowledges the importance of material or conceptual self-interest, which encompasses economic elements, as governing human action. But on the other hand, he argues that the worldview created by ideals often acts as the signalman, determining the trajectory, and on that trajectory, the dynamics of self-interest propel human action. The capitalist spirit, which I have described, is precisely that ideal. Weber focused on human actions and attempted to conduct sociological research by understanding them. One of his most famous arguments pertains to the typology of social action. Weber's theory of action is based on the following types: rational, purposeful action that anticipate the behaviour of others and uses anticipation as a condition and means to achieve a goal. Value rational action that follow absolute values such as ethical, aesthetic and religious. Emotional action derived from feelings and moods. And traditional action that are born from customs and long-standing beliefs that become habit. Prolin discusses the relationship between the emergence of a system of instrumental rationality in capitalism and a system of value rationality in the Protestant religion. In this case, the ideological type is also utilized. Ideal forms are conceptual analytical models that can be used as a means to understand cultural events and are purely logical models, fictitious objects that do not exist in reality but only in thought. By comparing the ideal form with the real thing, it is possible to understand the real thing, that is, the real world, for the first time. When we understand a social phenomenon, we must select from among the many elements involved those that can explain the relationship between the elements without contradiction, and then interpret and understand them. In his article, The Objectivity of Knowledge in Social Science and Social Policy, Weber states that the ideal type is an internally and coherently conceived cosmos of interconnectedness that has a utopian character and is far from empirical reality, which is why it can measure reality. The four types of action and the interpretation that the spirit of capitalism is an unintended consequence of Protestantism can both be understood as one conceptual framework. This image can be used to illustrate the extraction of the ideological types in Prolin's argument. Now that we have talked about Max Weber, we will move on to the final luminary of the foundational period in the history of sociology, earlier referred to as the second peak, Georg Simmel. As this is the end of the first session, we will begin the next session with the story of Simmel.